There have been tensions between the U.S. and its neighbor 90 miles to the south, Cuba, since 1959, 65 years. Why? And are there indications that change is on the horizon, or will the issues become more significant?
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon. I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they occur in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historical context in which these events occur. During each episode of this program, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and the broader historic context in which they occur. This enables you to better understand and analyze the events that impact the global village in which we live. My guest for today's show is a Cuban American journalist, radio host, author, and host of RT's Direct Impact. He is Ricardo Leon Sanchez de Ronaldo, also known as Rick Sanchez. Let's connect some dots. Rick, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great. Great to be here with you, Wilmer. Always a pleasure, Doctor.
Did I get it right?
Well, yeah, you did. I mean, I don't use it anymore, but it's funny. I guess at one point back in 1958, when I was born on July 3rd, my mother named me in little Guanabacoa, Cuba, a suburb just outside of Havana. The doctor said, "What are you going to name this kid? He's ugly as hell, but let's give him a name anyway." And she said, Ricardo Leon Sanchez Ronaldo. So there you go. It's part of the history in Latin America, which I think is a great thing. In our culture, you carry the mother's name for at least one generation. So when a woman marries a man and they have a child, that child will carry her name for at least that one generation. Whereas in our culture, you just throw the mother's name away.
Well, out of respect to your mother. So just a little historic context, because context for me is always so important. Cuba's ruler, Fulgencio Batista.
Oh yeah, the old Batista.
Was overthrown.
There. Good.
He was overthrown by Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, Che Guevara, and a lot of other folks in 1959.
That's correct.
This revolution had and continues to have powerful and profound domestic and international repercussions. Mm-hmm. Give us your thoughts on where the relationship between the countries, the U.S. and Cuba, is today. Because, for example, a lot of people don't really even appreciate the impact that this relationship has on U.S. domestic politics.
Oh my God, politics are fascinating in that sense. I don't think there's ever been a better example of a country that is being castigated more than Cuba has been castigated by the U.S. government. No country in the history of the world has been sanctioned and castigated economically for a longer period of time than Cuba has. The United States has done everything possible for some 70 years to literally keep Cuba under its thumb. By the way, and Cuba's economy has paid for it drastically. Remember, when I was in Cuba interviewing Fidel Castro in 1991, during Glasnost and Perestroika, I remember at the time that I talked to Castro and I asked him about what was happening. He seemed desperate. He had to be desperate to invite me to give me an interview on the island at the time, because they don't usually talk to gusanos. I am a gusano. A gusano means a worm. A worm is somebody who left the revolution and betrayed the revolution. But, I left because my parents left. I mean, I was 2 years old when I left Cuba. But it's funny, because I'll just say this. That era, that 1991, I go and I talk to Castro in Cuba, which was really fascinating. Then I go to New York and I talk to Gorbachev, and I asked Gorbachev. I was working as a correspondent at NBC, and I was working and I was assigned to go to New York to speak with President Gorbachev. And I asked President Gorbachev about Fidel Castro, and I said, "You were recently in Havana. You and Mr. Castro apparently have had a falling out. He didn't even go see you at the airport." And Gorbachev stops right there, Wilmer, and he says to me,
you know what your problem is? You know what the problem you have and the problem with all you Cubans? You're obsessed with Castro. Why are you asking me a question about Castro? With all the things going on in the world, I don't want to talk about Castro. Next question. I was like, whoa, I couldn't believe he was coming at me like that. But it just shows, there's an old story, if you want to talk history, and I wrote this once in one of my books. I said, and let's see if I can quote myself here. Cuba was the slave of the Spanish, the prostitutes of the Americans, and the child of the Soviets. It has always been taken and oppressed and used and mistreated by somebody. First, it was the Spanish. They broke from that. Then they got the Americans. The Americans really screwed the Cubans over in every way they could. Americans just owned 70% of the land in Cuba. Think about that for a minute. So it was easy for Fidel Castro to turn to these people back then and say to them, they own 70% of your land. You can't own a business here. They control the government. Batista works for the mafia, which he did, by the way. He was one of the most corrupt presidents. Literally, the mafia ran Havana. So when he says,
watch The Godfather.
Yeah, the scene in Godfather too. So in the end, let me close with this. The US government, like the Spanish government, and in many ways like the Soviets, all used and abused Cuba. And to this day, Cuba is suffering the consequences of it because it's a sad place economically to go. And the US to this day is doing everything possible to punish Cuba and keep them under the thumb with an embargo that still persists. And they also have them on a list called the states that condone terrorism list. There's only like 3 or 4 countries: Iran, Cuba, North Korea, and a couple others. And I mean, really, Cuba? It's like, so it's tough to be Cuba because of that.
So to that point, at the end of May, it was reported that the Biden administration eases some economic restrictions on Cuba. Private enterprises with no link to the government will be granted access to U.S. banks and additional internet services. The Biden administration seems to have amended and clarified a number of sanctions against Cuba, allowing private entrepreneurs and businesses to open U.S. bank accounts.
Yeah.
They portray this as increasing support for Cuban people, but we'll talk about what that really means. Mi pymes, the acronym micro, pequeñas, and medianas empresas.
Yes.
Rick Sanchez.
Small businesses is
small
what it
businesses.
means. Yeah, essentially. I mean, it's a bunch of acronyms. It's too many letters for a very simple description. You're absolutely right. And you know what? I think the Biden administration did a good thing with that. A lot of people have been pushing for it. And what it basically says is the Biden administration is looking at Cuba and saying, wow, there's something going on in Cuba for the first time in some 60 or 70 years. Now, I thought what Obama did was fantastic. Obama was the first president, thank God, who came along and said, why do we hate these people? Why do we have to have an enemy that's 90 miles away because of something between Khrushchev and Kennedy and Eisenhower? Man, that's been a long time. Let's turn over a new leaf. Let's start something new. And Obama allows the United States and people in the United States to start traveling to Cuba. Suddenly Cuba starts doing really well. People in Miami start going to see their cousins. They're buying, they're trading. Suddenly the Cuban economy starts to show signs of life. It was all really good.
Cruise lines.
What? Cruise lines. Exactly. The whole thing had the promise of starting all over again. So let me attack that first before I tell you about the people you mentioned a little while ago. But we have these absolute morons in Florida politics in particular. You have some idiot named Marco Rubio, for example. You got another guy named Rick Scott. You got these guys, they live off of hate. The only way that they can stay in power is to make sure the people in South Florida vote for them. And the only way they think the people in South Florida will vote for them if they scare them into thinking that somehow Cuba is the boogeyman. It's a horrible communist country that's coming to kill and blah, blah, blah. And because of that, people in South Florida, even if they really deep down don't think that, and even if they really deep down would love nothing more than to be able to visit their mom and their dad and their brothers and their sisters and to somehow create some kind of rapprochement with Cuba, they're afraid to say it. So they say publicly, oh, I hate Cuba, it's horrible, yay, Marco Rubio. They're afraid because they live in an environment in South Florida, which is run by the older exiles and by the Marco Rubios, where they think if they say that, they're not going to get a job. They're not going to be hired. Nobody wants to be called a communist in Miami. So it's this vicious cycle that has continued for so many years, and it's the politicians who continue that. Marco Rubio went to President Trump as soon as President Trump came into office, and he said, here's what you have to do. Cancel everything Obama did. Kill it. Destroy it. Make sure people are never allowed to go to Cuba. Make sure families are not allowed to see themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And this idiot Biden went along with it when he got into office. Instead of going back to the Obama thing, Biden's been acting like more of a Republican than the Republicans. So finally,
wait a minute, because he was playing to the politics in South Cuba,
in South Florida.
Yeah. I'm sorry, South Florida. Thank you.
Exactly.
He was playing to the politics, because when I look at if my memory serves me correctly, when I look at the demographic data of both Obama elections, when you break it out by age,
Yeah.
the older Cuban Americans voted Republican.
Mhm.
Their children
Voted for
voted Obama,
Yes,
which
they
is
did.
why Obama carried Florida both times.
And they voted for Clinton as well. But
Right.
yeah, it's interesting that soon after that, to be elected president in the United States, you must go to Miami and say that you're an anti-communist and down with Castro, even though he's dead, but people still think he's alive. Like people still think Russia's a communist country, but whatever. That's another.
And Elvis is still alive.
It's like, it's stupid, but whatever.
In fact, Elvis and Castro are going to be in Vegas in August.
So you have to come to South Florida if you're running for president and say all these patented lines like a script. But then Obama said, okay, I'm going to say all that crap. But then when I get into office, now that I'm in my second term, you know what? I'm going to try and open Cuba back up. Nobody's had the intestinal fortitude to do that. And by golly, I'm going to do it. And he did. And
Wait a minute.
Credit.
Was that partially due to agribusiness, U.S. agribusiness, seeing a market in Cuba?
Which still exists, by golly. But for some reason, Trump got rid of it because Trump does whatever he thinks some guy tells him, and he has a bunch of rich friends who are Cubans, so they told him, get rid of everything Obama did, so he did. And along now comes Biden, which brings us back to your point, and it's the MIPYMEs. Along now comes Biden, and enough people get to Biden and say, look, there's actually entrepreneurs in Cuba right now. There's these young guys who are starting these small businesses and their distribution centers, and they're actually beating the government at their own game. You got a socialist country, and you have all these young entrepreneurs who are selling vacuum cleaners and clothes and water bottles and glasses. I visited them. I was just there the other day in Cuba, and I was amazed by what I saw. So somebody got to Biden and said, look, if nothing else, throw these guys a bone. There is right now so many restrictions on any Cuban citizen. They can't use phones. They can't use internet. They can't use American banks. They can't trade with other countries. They are totally isolated, locked up. It's nasty and a horrible, one of the worst sanctions in the world. So finally, along comes Biden or somebody in the Biden administration, and they open that up a little bit, and they let these entrepreneurs start to have banks in Florida. Good idea. Now, the other side, the Cuban government looks at this and says, whoa, wait a minute. So, but the way you wrote this, you say they can't have any ties to the Cuban government. So you're saying you're going to run an enterprise again in our country, but we're not allowed to monitor it. We're not allowed to tax it. We're not allowed to have contact with them. Go to hell. We're not going to do that. I mean, this is back to Batista again. You guys want to control the economy of our country. So when I met with Cuban officials in Havana last weekend, and I sat down with somebody from the president's office, but not the president himself, but one of the high-ranking foreign policy guy,
He said, look, here's how we feel about, because I told him, I said, look, whatever it takes, go along with it. This will be good for the Cuban people. And he goes, look, we want to go along with it, but we've got to protect ourselves too. I mean, we want to make sure that we at least have some say in this new system.
It is our country.
That's where the thing, where the thing is difficult. So, but you know what? In the end, though, I think, my bottle's half full. I'm a half full guy. I think this is a good thing. It might be a starting place, and it might be the beginning of something that could hopefully flourish and turn Cuba into what it should be. It's a beautiful island, a mecca for tourism, where a lot of very successful people have come from. It's such a shame that it's deteriorated into what it's become, simply because the United States was angry 70 years ago and has never stopped being angry, and has now turned it into a political football.
First of all, it was the mob that was pissed 70 years ago.
That's true.
And so one of the things that I've been saying for a number of years, United States, if your game is as good as you says it is, then alleviate the sanctions, remove the sanctions, let the Cuban people see the benefit of the United States.
Yeah.
And if your game is as good as you say it is, then stop sanctioning them, because we know sanctions have never worked. All sanctions do is create a greater sense of nationalism.
Yeah.
Because the entity in charge is able to say, your suffering is not my fault, your suffering is their fault. They're the ones that are not allowing you to trade. They're the ones that are not allowing you to talk to your relatives in the United, all of that. So it creates a greater sense of them versus us nationalism. So I've been saying for years, just release the sanctions. Let the Cuban people decide for themselves. Now, with all that being said,
right, and here's, let me just underscore, here's where you're right, because what you're saying is, by having sanctions, you give the Cuban government an excuse to fail, which they have taken, and most countries do. They say, well, how? And by the way, I mean, they're partly right. How the hell can we succeed? We're not allowed to trade with other countries. We can't trade with you. We're not allowed to do business in the United States. We can't buy oil and gas from any of NATO countries or any European countries or any G7 or anything. So we're kind of flummoxed here in not being able to succeed the way we should. Now, the Cuban government has also made its economic stupid mistakes as well, to be fair. But nonetheless, they do have that excuse, and it only exists because of the embargo. You're right.
So now, my question to you, when you've talked to the Cuban officials, did anybody mention the National Endowment for Democracy? And here's why I asked that question. Because what this whole MIPIMES, and help me up with the pronunciation.
No, that's right. MIPIMES.
MIPIMES. What this whole thing sounds like to me is the NDA, the National Endowment for Democracy, like they went into Ukraine and and Victoria Nuland threw around a bunch of cookies to a bunch of Nazis, and they overthrew the Ukrainian government. This sounds eerily reminiscent of a tactic used by the NDA. We're going to fund Cuban small businesses. We're going to show them the wonderful benefits of democracy in the United States as we entice them to overthrow their government. Is that a concern that the Cuban government has?
It is, and it should be. Okay. But at the same time, speaking to you as a Cuban who has watched the history of this country for so many years, when you're eating dirt, anything becomes a sirloin steak, you know? So at this point, the level of desperation in Cuba is so bad. I mean, I don't know if you've had a chance to go there, but recently it's as bad as I've ever seen it. The people are really hungry. I mean, nothing works. Everything is slow. There's no efficiency. I mean, it is down to a crawl in Cuba. And if they can at least have something that works, I mean, you compare it to Ukraine, but Ukraine is like one of the basket
the
Oh,
bread
sure.
of the
Most
world.
corrupt countries in the world.
And it has a good economy. The only problem with Ukraine was it was super corrupt, but the economy was good. There's billionaires in Ukraine. I mean, there ain't no billionaires in Cuba, my friend.
Right.
I mean, it's
No. I only compare it. I only compare it to
Yeah.
Ukraine in the context of the NDA's involvement in fomenting a coup, because the president in 2014, was that Yanukovych?
Yeah.
Was in the eyes of the United States too close to Russia in
You're
order
smart.
to.
You're smart to say that. You're smart to say that. And I think you're right. I think we would be foolhardy not to consider that, given our history, the United States of America, this country we love, but can't help but notice that our CIA goes all over the world and screws things up and abuses people and kills people and assassinates people. They tried 13 times to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Right.
I mean, they put poison in his cigar. They put poison in his diving suit. I mean, it's crazy. So yeah, we need to also remember and reconcile into anything we look at exactly what our State Department and our CIA and the administration, whatever administration it is capable of based on the history and what they've done in the past. That said, I still believe we should try and be optimistic about this and try and figure out a way to use good old-fashioned ingenuity to make this work. And I think it's at least the beginning of an opening that didn't exist before. The problem is, as soon as there's another presidential election, whatever's done that moves the needle forward will be pushed back, because Marco Rubio and Rick Scott and all these other morons who could give a crap about the people of Cuba, who are really the ones suffering, not the government.
Right.
They could give a crap about those people, will do whatever it takes to squeeze the hell out of the Cuban economy even more, just like they've done in Venezuela and in other places around the world, Guatemala, et cetera, because they're mad at some guy who may have said something leftist. It's nuts, but that's actually what has taken place and what our government has done, as you well know.
So the question that I posed is, are there indications that change is on the horizon, or will the issues become more significant? And the latter part of that question has to do with last week, a squadron of Russian ships, including a frigate capable of firing hypersonic missiles, arrived in Cuba as part of an international partnership program. Now, that initially took me back to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It was a show. It was a show. Well,
Go
listen,
ahead.
the genesis of that, you well know, because I know you and I speak a lot and we talk about these things. But the genesis of that is that both Macron and President Biden intimated that they would be willing to use missiles, our missiles. They will give permission to Ukraine to shoot missiles into Russian territory. The next day, Putin picked up the phone and says, oh, so let's see, they have a country next to our territory. Guess what? We've got some friends next to their territory too. He picked up the phone and sent 3 ships to the Cuban harbor. Why? To send the world a message that two can play that game. And essentially, it's a tit for tat, where Putin is trying to tell the U.S. administration, okay, you got some missiles in Ukraine. I got some nuclear subs in Havana. Let's talk. By the way, we got more nuclear warheads than you guys do. You want to start this thing? Let's go. I mean, it was like, oh my God. And the world, and I'm sure there's a lot of bravado coming from Washington, but in the end, I guarantee you they kind of got the message. And I mean, I almost get the sense there's already backing off going on, because a lot of NATO countries, and certainly half of the MPs in the German parliament, came forward and said, this is crazy. Stop this crap. No more weapons to Ukraine that can be used to shoot into Russia, that can start another world war that we are going to have to pay for, not the Yankees, not the Americans. So I wouldn't be surprised if the genesis of that, which led to that, which was you just mentioned as the 3 ships in Havana, is what may be causing a little bit of a slowdown now in the Ukraine push, especially on the part of many members of the European community.
So what does that say to you about the empire? What does that say to you? Because 10 years ago, going back to The Godfather, when I'm drawing a blank on the dude's name, when the Turk hit the Don, and they said 10 years ago, could we have gotten to the Don like that? Sollozzo. When Sollozzo
Right.
hit the Don
Right.
10 years ago, could we have got the Don is slipping? So is the Don, the U.S., is the Don slipping? Because 10 years ago, Vladimir Putin couldn't have made that play.
No, let me just say this, and it's a two-part answer, I think. One, I think if you ask the average American in the United States, should the embargo be lifted? I think 90% of them will say yes.
Absolutely.
They think it's silly.
Absolutely.
If you ask the average young American under 30 or something, and tell them they can't go to Cuba unless they fill out 19 forms and get a special visa and all kinds of crap, whatever it is.
Or fly to the moon and get a flight from
Right.
Southwest from the moon.
They're going to say, why? Why?
Right.
It's what's the difference between that and Mexico? That and the Bahamas? Cuba's right next to the Bahamas. People go back and forth between the Bahamas and Cuba every day, and they're fishing together and stuff. So it makes no sense. It's silly. So two things. A, as time goes by, younger people will look at this and think it's just ridiculous, shameful, and foolhardy. Two, when I spoke with Cuban officials in Havana last weekend, and we were sitting in the hotel bar, and I asked the ambassador, the guy who used to be the ambassador to the United Nations, Cabana, who's an interesting man and very guarded, and I said, are you guys going to play a waiting game? And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, you know what's going on in the world. The Western powers are now being pushed back by Brazil, which is your friend, by Iran, which is your friend, by Russia,
Venezuela,
your friend, right? China, which is your friend. So suddenly you have all these allies who've created these interesting consortiums, which are fighting back against the Western power, which have always had you under your thumb. So does that make you look at things a little differently? And he just kind of smiled at me and he said, we're playing by different rules now. And I said, okay, we'll leave it at that because I don't want to get myself or you in trouble. So I get a sense that they know that, and they think that could be a rapprochement as well for the island.
And for people to really understand, they have to understand the development of BRICS.
Of course.
They have to understand a number of the leaders that the United States labels as dictators and labels as anything but a child of God. President Xi Jinping is traversing the world and is a respected diplomat. Vladimir Putin, traversing the world, a respected diplomat. Nicolas Maduro, traveling. He's sitting in Iran, talking with President, the Supreme Leader, Khomeini. These guys are being recognized internationally as diplomats. Tony Blinken is considered a goon.
Yeah. It's funny the way things have now developed, and we are seeing a world that's changing. And I think that the world order, for lack of a better term, is not what it was before. And Cuba is really, I think, in a unique position. I mean, here's an island with 11 million people that's 90 miles away from the United States and has had a 70-year torment of economic sanctions and resistance against it. And suddenly it's in a position where it can finally make peace with Washington, or it can tell Washington to go to hell and say, you know what? We're going to be a part of BRICS. We're going to be a part of the global South. We're going to be a part of all of these things. And we don't want anything from you anymore. We think we can get it over here, especially if there's a change in currency or in the monetary policy that these guys are able to adjust. So,
which they are in fact implementing. Look at the deal between India and Russia. India is buying Russian oil based on the ruble, which, by the way, Joe Biden said he was going to turn it into ruble, but that's now one of the top 5 fastest growing economies in the world.
Well, but the thing that bothers me about all of this, and I think it probably bothers you too, is there's just the all-out hypocrisy.
Yes.
I'll give you an example of something that happened overnight, just within the last 24 hours. The Chinese have apparently come up with a fantastic EV. I drive a Tesla. I love EVs. I think
Apparently they've come up with something that they make for like 20 to 30,000 less than what I paid for my
I
my
thought it was
Model Y.
$15. They make it for like $10.
Yeah, it's crazy. They're making, and it's a great vehicle. It's fantastic. So they basically said, we want to introduce this car, this Chinese car, the Chinese technology into Europe. And the Europeans are saying, no, screw you. We're not going to let you do it. You want to put your cars in here? We're going to give you a 40% tariff, 38.7 actually, but pretty close. Man, that's almost half. That means if they sell a car for $20,000, they really have to sell it. People there still have to pay 40 plus, be the administrative fees and everything else. The tariff alone is brutal. It's punishment. So yesterday afternoon, Beijing announced it's going to start considering putting tariffs on all pork products. Now, the Chinese eat more pork than anybody in the world, right? 50% of the pork that's eaten in China comes from Europe. So the Chinese are now telling the Europeans, okay, you want to put a 40% tariff on our cars and our technology? We're going to put a 40% tariff on the pork. The poor Spaniards, which, by the way, is where all the 50% of the pork eaten in China comes from Europe, and 20% of that comes from Spain. So the who's going to get screwed? The poor farmer in Spain who makes, who has the pig farm. So the whole thing is cyclical. But my main point in that story is, I thought that we were the country who pushed for democracy and free markets.
Free markets.
Where
the invisible hand. Let the market decide winners and losers. Adam Smith told us that.
Right. It goes back to your point about Cuba. It's like we say, well, we don't like Cuba because it's a communist country. So we do everything possible for them not to be able to compete in the free market. And then we say we believe in the free market. Well, if you believe in the free market, you got to let China play. You got to let Cuba play. And you can't say, I don't like how they smell, or I don't like their policies, or I don't like their system of government. Everybody gets to play. Right? That's what the free market means. So
by the by, just really quickly, the United States made the conscious decision to export its manufacturing to China. We deindustrialized the United States.
Yes.
Why? For cheaper labor. Why? For greater profit. Now what we found is the Chinese have found a better way to beat us at our own game. Yeah. Once you learn how to play the game, then you got to learn how the game gets played. Mm-hmm. And we can't break that code. I got it, my brother, Rick Sanchez. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I love you, man. You're a great guy and a great friend and a great golf partner.
Well, you are too kind. You probably just need to get out more. Hey, folks, thank you so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me. I'm a great guy. I'm a great friend. I'm a great golf partner, according to Rick Sanchez. With me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned for new episodes every week. Also, please, please, please follow and subscribe. Leave a review. Share the show. Follow us on social media. You'll find all the links below in the description. Go to that Patreon site, please. Make a contribution because, hey, I got to pay Rick. It ain't cheap. Anyway, this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter. We don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you again next time. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great one. Peace and blessings. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.